Okay, so it's wonderful to be after Joanna, but especially for our first-year students, I think I'm very excited that you gave kind of a very good overview of fluency. You just started your master's program in learning disabilities, and it's a good, you're very fortunate to hear the leading figures in the field. It was good also just to take a step back and define what fluency is. And I really want to continue everything that we've heard this morning to give a short, because I know this is the afternoon, but hopefully a little bit controversial talk about the role of the right brain, the right reading brain, and reading, to look at reading rate and accuracy following a very specific extreme case of hemispherectomy. And everything that we've heard this morning made a very strong link between speech and language and reading. And we want to talk about two cases that John started to talk about, the patients with the periventricular nodular heterotopia, but then also to look at more extreme cases of what do you do if you don't have your left hemisphere at all. So I wanted to start and talk a little bit about rate and accuracy in different profiles of reading challenges, and then, as I said, to look at the hemispherectomy patients. So one debate in the field for many, many years, and Via began this morning is, well, is rate a dependent or independent variable in reading? And do the two processes, specifically when we look at the lower processes that John talked about, rapid naming, do rapid naming and phonological awareness, do they sit under the same construct, or are they separate constructs? And there are different ways you can answer this question. One way to answer it is, how do we look at dyslexic children or individuals with dyslexia? Are they homogeneous population? Do all of them have the shared deficits in phonological awareness? Or are they heterogeneous populations? And in my dissertation work with Marianne Wolf many years ago, what we looked at is actually different children with different types of profiles. Some of them had just phonological awareness deficits. Some of them had just rapid naming deficits, which are fluency deficits. And the majority had both. Another way to look at it, and this work has been found now in different languages. Carmen, which will present in the conference, will talk about Spanish. It's been found in Hebrew. It's been found in other languages. Another way to answer this question is to look at, do we find unique populations that actually have one deficit and don't have the other? Another way to look at it is also some of the work that Joanna presented, is to see the networks in the brain that are involved in phonological processes versus the networks that are involved in rapid naming. Now, this may seem as a tedious question, especially to the students in the audience. If they have dyslexia, but it's a very important question, because the question is, where do you do the intervention? If you're just going to intervene at phonology, it's going to solve rate. If you're just going to intervene at rate, it's going to solve phonology. But if you think these are two separate constructs, you're going to intervene for both. Just as we heard Svia, who's been working on this for so many years, on this rapid acceleration program that actually pushes rate. So the case, indeed, that John began to work to tell you about, of the individuals with the periventricular nodular heterotopia, is a very interesting case, and I don't have to talk a lot about it because she explained it. But what was interesting about them is that these patients, and Bernard Chegg has been working with them for many years, and then I joined some of that work, they don't exhibit, despite their unique neurological profile, and despite having nodules, they don't exhibit general cognitive deficits. They don't exhibit deficits in memory. They don't exhibit general speed of processing deficits, not on the waist, not on trails, race, self. Even with Murit, all of us who were involved in this study, we ran a temporal order judgment task, Murit Brazilai. We didn't see any specific deficits. They just show us something. We still haven't figured it out, but they do definitely exhibit an isolated deficit in reading fluency. So they don't have, and for sure, they do not exhibit deficits on phonological awareness, nor on decoding. What's interesting is when you do look at this fluency, nor on IQ, is that that's the one place where they look like our dyslexic adults, that they show specific, isolated, fluency-related problems in the test of word reading efficiency and on rapid naming. When we went on to do a DTI analysis of this population, really to look at the tracks that are related, what was really interesting, I'm sorry, the slide didn't come out from the map, but what was really interesting is that when we did a DTI analysis, what we found was a correlation between white matter and rapid naming, a significant correlation, but we did not find a correlation between white matter and phonological awareness. So kind of pointing the idea that even Ross Polgrat did many years ago of this relationship of white matter to fluency. Then another study with one of the students, with Walker, looked at the correlation between cortical volume and then different aspects, cognitive aspects. And here there was a negative but significant relationship between cortical volume and IQ, but no relationship to fluency. So we find this separate trajectory of fluency being related to white matter, but not being related to cortical volume. So moving on from that case, we had the opportunity to work with a different population. And here, especially for a student, I want to say something on a personal note. Sometimes when you're a researcher, you're looking for interesting populations and you want to help them. But in our program, there's a big and important link between practice and research. And the way we got to this type of research was that there was this young man, and his name was Brooke. And he came to Harvard many years ago. He actually, another colleague of ours, Mary Helen Mordino-Young, did her whole dissertation on this young man. He went through a hemispherectomy, and she studied his emotional and positive processing. This is for Jane later. And then many years later, and I knew this young man, I happened to be on the West Coast, and so was he, and he wanted to learn to read. And this is how he got to me. This is how I got to this study. And I started to look at his reading profile. And through him, we got exposed to a much larger population who went through, this is a very extreme case. So if we're talking about dyslexic, we heard today about patients with epilepsy and other types of lesions. This is a very extreme case. It's a young man who his whole left hemisphere got taken out when he was 10 years old. Due to something that's called Rasmussen's. You can think about it as a very severe form of epilepsy. It was surprising to me that this type of treatment is not so rare. In the United States alone, there are 1,000 people walking around with half of their brain, much more than you would expect. And he wanted to learn how to read, and I'll begin by the end. This young man was able to read. I worked with him and I worked with a tutor, and it was a very optimistic story, just to see his development. With 6 months, he grew 2 grade, so he went from being at the 2nd grade level to being at the 4th grade level. And this raises a lot of questions, because everything you've heard today and a lot of the imaging data that you saw today really makes the claim that reading sits on language circuits. It's a very strong relationship. In recent years, there's more interest to see what is the interplay between the hemispheres. So there's more interest in what's happening in the right hemisphere, and Svea presented data, and there was data from Temple and from Shayowitz, that typically when we think about the right reading, especially for dyslexics, it's more compensatory roots. So the dyslexics rely sometimes more on the compensatory right temporal parietal cortex. So what happens if you don't have any of your left hemisphere? So this raises just general questions that are interesting about early plasticity versus early vulnerability. So we know that there's something plastic about language, but is there a window of opportunity that closes, or this window doesn't close? Are there specific cerebral functions, such as speech, memory, that are innately specialized to particular brain regions? Or can we think about this immature brain as equipotential? And we heard some of it today from Scott's work, where there's minimal function localizations, and then the areas that probably have some type of lesion, maybe they can get reorganized to a different area of the brain. So if you think about the right hemisphere, is the reading network really just localized to the left hemisphere, or is there something like a dormant network in the right hemisphere? Then in severe cases, we can wake it up. So what do we know about language with half of our brain? So there are studies about language that following a left hemispherectomy in childhood Children often everyday receptive and productive, and we heard about it also this morning in productive and also over lunch with Scott Holland. Receptive and productive language functions are often spared, provided that the right hemisphere is relatively intact, and provided most typically when this happens early on in life, less so when it happens late on in life. But even in children who have the operation late, there are some findings that improve language ability post-operation in a child who was 15 years old and she had the operation when she was 12. Some interhemispheric transfer in patients who had the surgery after age 9, but most of these studies focused on language. They do not focus on the reading ability, and reading, as we know, is a much more intricate network than language. You need to recruit many more areas. So about reading, really not a lot of studies. Behavioral studies of 6 adults in the mid-90s, that those who had the surgery late exhibited very impaired profile. There was one imaging study that actually found some reading abilities in homologous areas in the right brain. So we had the opportunity, because also what happened, this is also more to give you kind of a socio-historical context, and this is especially also for a student. The Hemispherectomy Foundation got interested in this work because they have a lot of the population and they want to characterize their children and they want to know what can be done about it. So this is a sample, and this is work that's really been conducted with very closely with Joanna and with her colleague Stella DeBode. These are 10 individuals who all went through a hemispherectomy. And what's interesting about them, all of them, these ones all had their left hemisphere taken out. We also are working with a sample with the ones who had the right hemisphere taken out. What's interesting about them is that some of them had prenatal insult and some of them had postnatal insult. You can see that this is very, we don't need to go into this. Let's see the later pointer. Some of them, the age of Caesar starts at age 1. Some of them already starts in the uterus, and some of them, it starts later on in age 9, age 4, age 3. This is a very heterogeneous phenomenon. I'm not going to go about all of these readings, but I'm going to go now and show you the graphs about it. So let's look. We first did a behavioral analysis of them. So in terms of the receptive language, now again, you have to remember this is a very clinical population, so we have to kind of be more lenient in how we look at them. 50% of this population is actually where they should be in terms of their receptive language. 50% are below, but even those are below have acquired receptive language. They have developed, and some of the language skills have transferred. Phonological awareness. Professor Miller before asked, can you have reading without phonological awareness from your work with the deaf? So none of these have acquired age-equivalent phonological awareness. Probably they reach, this is their chronological age versus their test age. What you can see over here, this is why I'm not very good with technology. Hold on. What you can see is that one of them reaches the age 9, but typically they stop at the age of 6. So they do not, this has not shown plasticity. They do not acquire phonological awareness. However, when you look at word identification, 40% of them are at their word reading level where they should be. 60% are below, but they have developed some reading skills. And this is what's so interesting. Svea, I hope you will be very interested in this. 55% of them, actually, when you give them a word reading task, the test of word reading efficiency where you have to read quickly, so more of them do better when they're asked to read quickly than when they're not given a time constraint. And I think this is very related to this acceleration phenomena. So when you push them to their limits and you tell them to read faster, they're actually able to do it. A good chunk of them. Very same with phonological decoding efficiency with fluency. And 30% of them are at age level in terms of the comprehension. So again, you have to remember, this is a population that does not have their whole left hemisphere. So you can say it's not all of them, but it's very encouraging. So this is just a percentage of how they look. And what's interesting is that some of these patients with a hemispherectomy, their fluency is better than our dyslexics. So sometimes half a brain is better than a full one. Another interesting thing is that we didn't find, this is very preliminary work. We didn't find correlations on any of the measures with the age of the surgery, nor with the age of the seizure onset. So this is still a puzzle, who's doing better. We then went on to give them, some of them, and we're in the process of collecting data, imaging, to see what happens in their brain when they read. So we gave them a print-mediated rhyming task. This is just the control. And then a non-print. And this is what's fascinating. These are the subjects. This is just their accuracy rate up there. What we see is that the network that they use in the right hemisphere is very similar to the network that typical readers use. This is not similar to the dyslexic network, which means that this network may be, if you think about a crowding effect, that something is there and then something else gets taken out. This is really, it may suggest some type of equal potentiality. DeHaene talks about reading as a recycling mechanism in the brain, that reading, there's no center for reading. You take what's there and you build on it. And this suggests that at least in the cases that were able to compensate for reading, they're able to build the parallel network in the right brain. So half a brain versus a full one. We still don't know who are the children that have the most promise to developing reading, because some of them, it wasn't all of them the prenatal. This is very important to say. Some of them were also that had the seizures prenatally. Some of them had late surgery. So we can look at plasticity on this recovery continuum on several related factors. Injury-related factor, the nature, the severity, the timing of the insult, constitutional factors, developmental stage, the cognitive capacity, the genetic makeup. But we can also look at the environment. Now, I also have to say that except for Brooke, that I personally work with, none of these children received intense intervention. Most of them come from low SES. They just received the typical type of intervention they would receive in the school. Joanna and Stella and I really now want to plan a further study to see how much we can help them with an intense intervention. But the conclusion. First of all, the right hemisphere, even by itself, has the potential to support reading fluency. Another conclusion is this further supports the idea that fluency and phonological awareness are not necessarily the same construct, because we see isolated deficits, and we see here something very interesting, that for us, for so many of us that were trained that phonology is necessary, maybe in some extreme cases, I'm not talking about the majority of cases, but in some extreme cases, you can develop reading without phonology. And it can tell you again about different pathways of the brain, that some pathways are bottom up, but for this population, probably a lot of the pathways are top down. So our future direction for this study is really to look at individualized and tailored intervention, to look more at the neurological pathways in reading. We got a lot of ideas this morning. And really to see what is the genetic component, and is there a genetic component also in the road to recovery, or to reading recovery. So I promise to be short. Thank you.
Not just compensatory, but sort of the normal parallels Makes sense. Not top down. How they said yeah, exactly. We forgot about things. Kind of interactive processes which comes to the not only one and mainly the brain that it doesn't function. So you need a conscious support.
And this may go to the city executive stuff. And we respond. I think this could go to that. So that's nice. Can I ask one for you? So do you think these hemiparetropic neurons they look like they're